Some of you may know I struggle a little bit with sermon titles sometimes, and I struggled with this sermon title. I had originally named this sermon after Public Enemy's 1990 record, Fear of a Black Planet. I was going to title the sermon, Fear of a Black Unitarian Universalism, until a friend pointed out to me that title may somehow indicate to you that Black Unitarian Universalism does not already exist. And it definitely does. Praise be, Black Unitarian Universalism is thriving these days more than possibly any other time in the history of this faith tradition. The clip you just saw was taken just last week at the inaugural Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism Harper Jordan Memorial Symposium, a symposium that responds to the longing of many Black Unitarian Universalists to more fully understand where they have been, where they are now, and how they hope to live out their Unitarian Universalism as Black people. The 4-day gathering held in Minneapolis, Minnesota just last weekend offered educational plenaries, spiritual grounding that spoke directly to the learning and was chock full of networking and community building opportunities. The symposium explored an articulation of Unitarian Universalism that is unapologetically Black and proceeds from co-creation and co-development, such that we might proclaim and clarify a vision for Black Unitarian Universalism. The symposium, open to everyone, was named for Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, an abolitionist, a suffragist, a writer, and a Unitarian, and Reverend Joseph Jordan, the first Black ordained Universalist. I have watched some of the plenaries, and you can too. It's available if you Google the Black Lives UU, blue.org will get you there. And I decided now would be the right time to let you in on one of my visions of ministry for Unitarian Universalism and specifically for the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta. Now, it probably won't be a secret to you because it is already articulated and proclaimed within this congregation's Aramac resolution from a few years ago, that anti-racism, anti-oppression, multiculturalism resolution. But regardless of that, it needs to be articulated and shared in as many ways as possible from this pulpit and beyond. In a world that seeks to divide us, we know there is another way. We know this. In a city that has burned and struggled and been redlined, bifurcated, that has innovated, has come together and broken apart, we can be part of Atlanta's healing and hope. Heaven bent on an Atlanta that can take its shattered history and piece together a beautifully mosaicked and multiracial future. So the vision is for UUCA to become a fully multiracial, multicultural, queer-loving, multi-belief congregation that is working on itself, that is working harder to love Christians and atheists who all come here to worship, that can make space for humanists and agnostics, that can offer a place for pagan ritual and goddess-centered faith, that can hold it all, not perfectly, but artfully, flexibly, and beautifully. That is the vision. And I welcome this challenge in this time and place, in our wilderness experience, as we move to our permanent next location. We already have figured out we don't need a building to be the salvific worshiping community that can transform and heal Atlanta. In some ways, we are released. We are liberated from some trappings. I mean, I talk to colleagues who have to spend a lot of time and money upkeeping their ancient, beautiful church structures. So there's various types of, church envy to have, and I don't have that. Now, I want to tell you, this is by no means the most challenging moment in the life of this congregation. In fact, it is not even close. So I want to talk about the history of this congregation, and I want to trouble a little bit of the story we have about its history, if you'll journey back with me. The early UU Church of Atlanta struggled mightily with outside attacks of communism and also inside ruptures around integration. In the mid to late 1940s, as the church was wrestling with public insinuations of communist complicity, a real shift in long-standing and fundamental Southern segregation policies was already underway. Changes to the Southern Jim Crow traditions were afoot in various legal locations. And in 1947, the Massachusetts-born Universalist minister, Reverend Isaiah Domas, in words and actions, he reflected this change that was going on in the South. Upon arriving in Atlanta, Domas took a one-day-a-week job at Atlanta University, a predominantly black college. Reverend Domas was also reserved the right to meet with whomever he chose in his home, and that company included his colleague, Dr. Thomas Baker Jones, a black Unitarian from Ohio. Reverend Domas considered it a heart-sickening duty to discourage Dr. Jones from attending Sunday services at his Unitarian congregation of Atlanta. And so he didn't. Dr. Jones did attend a Sunday service in November 1947. Reverend Domas recounted the event. He was seated without incident, even taking the offering, but the matter was hardly allowed to rest there. An ultra-race-conscious minority promptly rushed to the telephone and served notice to two members of the board with whom they were connected with that I should be fired immediately. Reverend Domas's daughter described what happened next as seen from the parsonage located next to the church on West Peachtree Street. She wrote, "When the Ku Klux Klan threatened our family in the fall of 1947, I was too young to be told and too short to look out the high windows. If I saw anything alarming, it was the odd way my parents stared at the street. My mother stood on one side of a closed drape, my father on the other. Each lifted just enough cloth to let in a sharp slice of Georgia sunlight. On West Peachtree Street, 2 floors below, a convoy of battered cars and rusty pickup trucks stretched from 3rd Street to Ponce de Leon. Each was full of Klansmen in full white robes, tilting back their pointed hoods to hunt for motion beyond our drapes. Several weeks later, the church voted to exclude black people from all church functions. The local newspaper reported the news with an article entitled, 'Wallasites Church Votes Negro Ban.' Reverend Domas offered his resignation to the Board of Trustees, and the church subsequently voted to accept his resignation by a vote of 33 to 32. So he only ended up serving for 1 year. It was a small congregation at that point. At its May 1948 meeting, the Unitarian Ministers Association responded to these actions taken by the church by refusing to send any future candidates to Atlanta until the church reversed its segregationist policy. At the October 1950 meeting of the Unitarian Association Board of Directors, a recommendation was made and accepted that both the Unitarian Church of America and the Universalist Church of America and the American UU Association withdraw support from the Atlanta congregation. In September 1951, the American Unitarian Association sold the church building on West Peachtree Street, and the church was officially disbanded. Now, following the sale of the church building and the disbanding of that original congregation, the Universalist Church of America and the AUA coordinated efforts to raise a new liberal church in Atlanta. Reverend Glenn Canfield was dispatched to the city early in '52. He successfully regrouped several former members and attracted new members and recharted what became the United Liberal Church. Now raise your hand if you've heard of the United Liberal Church in Atlanta. So some of you are familiar with this time, and we do have a couple of members who have been members since it was called that. In 1966, the church changed its name to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta, UUCA. In a newspaper article in the Atlanta Constitution on May 5th, 1952, it was noted that Reverend Canfield brought to Atlanta a lively sermon style that was characterized by a 2-hour sermon and included a discussion session. I only included this detail for comparative purposes. There's no other reason. Just so you know, not a threat, just awareness. Religious services were conducted those days at the Briarcliff Hotel. While services were held at the Briarcliff Hotel, Reverend Canfield recalled that he had a discussion with the hotel manager regarding people entering the hotel for the worship services. Adults entered the meeting room directly from the street, but children entered through the main lobby. Since services were integrated, black children were entering the hotel via the main lobby. And although the hotel manager was mildly sympathetic, he indicated that the hotel was a public place and he would lose his job if anyone saw black children going through the main entrance. And so Reverend Canfield and others worked diligently to find an alternative meeting space where they could hold integrated worship services. In October 1952, the Unitarians and the Universalists began negotiations with the Latter-day Saints to share their worship space at 605 Boulevard Northeast in this building. Reverend Canfield reported that the liberals and the Mormons have reached complete and amicable agreement, at least on some things. So you can see that our congregation's history is not as clear-cut as being, quote, the first integrated church in Atlanta. Even that title is complex, circuitous. It is fraught with fissures and fractures. Now, what is being explored and accomplished today in the wider world of Unitarian Universalism offers us a fresh path, a heartening way of expressing Unitarian Universalism. Now, I share the concern of a congregant leader in our congregation, a black UU, who asked a group of us, when people say they want our congregation to be diverse, do they mean it? What if we had more black staff than white? What if we had more black members or members of color than white members here? Is that what people mean when they speak of diversity? Or do they have a threshold, a limit for their own comfort? It's an interesting question. Look, I know I am white. Seriously, I think it's important to know that. I have a spiritual discipline of staying aware of my privilege, keeping conversation partners who keep me aware of my whiteness and my privilege. Now, I was raised in a neighborhood and in a school just outside of Chicago where white kids were not the majority. And I am grateful to have grown up code switching. And I am still connected with many of those early childhood friendships that I had. It is still a spiritual discipline for me to try to place myself in situations where I am the racial minority, to remember the gift of that feeling, since these days I sadly lack that experience in my life, to my and my family's detriment. And as a minister, I have to tell you, I wrestle each week with the question, to whom am I preaching? Because I dream of that church Howard Thurman started in San Francisco that is fully multiracial, multicultural, that can hold all of those complexities of belief and identity. but Howard Thurman had some things to say about religion, about Christianity as he understood it. In 1976, Thurman wrote, "I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times that I have heard a sermon on the meaning of religion to the man who stands with his back against the wall. It is urgent that my meaning be crystal clear. The masses of people live with their backs constantly against the wall. They are the poor, the disinherited, the dispossessed. What does our religion say to them? The issue is not what it counsels for them to do for others whose needs may be greater, but what religion offers to meet their own needs. The search for an answer to this question is perhaps the most important religious question of modern life." This was the very, I think, early work of liberation theology he was doing in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And I would make this claim. This is also true for Unitarian Universalism until recent years. And I believe Thurman speaks to all of us now in our days of rage in 2019, when he said, "During the early days of the war, I noticed a definite rise in rudeness, an overt expression of color prejudice, especially in trains and other public places. It was very simple. Hatred could be brought out into the open, given a formal dignity and a place of respectability. But for the most part, we are not vocal about our hatred. Hating is something of which to be ashamed, unless it provides for us a form of validation and prestige. If either is provided, then the amoral character of the hatred is transformed into active violence." And friends, we are here in 2019. Hatred has been given validation and prestige. The person who represents our nation to the world wields hatred as a weapon. And this calls for love that is more powerful, more clear, more disciplined, and more radical in its expression. Hatred cannot be defined, Thurman said. It can only be described. In the first place, hatred often begins in a situation in which there is contact without fellowship, contact that is devoid of any of the primary overtures of warmth and fellow feeling and genuineness. Of course, it is easy to have fellowship on your own terms and to repudiate it if your terms are not acceptable, Howard Thurman wrote. And then, in 1976, Howard Thurman wrote about the insidious effects of social media and our internet communications. He didn't really, but how could he? But he did. Listen. It is clear that so much of modern life is so impersonal that there is always the opportunity for the seeds of hatred to grow unmolested. Where there are contacts devoid of genuine fellowship, such actions stand in immediate candidacy for hatred. Thurman says, unsympathetic understanding is the characteristic attitude governing the relation between the weak and the strong. Thurman said when the Southern, and he, by the way, I forgot to tell you, was Atlanta-based. He did for a long time. He taught at Spelman and Morehouse. When the Southern white says, "I understand the Negro," what he really means is that he has a knowledge of the Negro within the limitations of the boundaries which the white man has set up. The kind of black person he understands has no existence except in his own mind. This unsympathetic understanding, that kind of hatred is paternalistic. It is complex and insidious. And those with privilege must be on guard for it at all times. Hatred in the mind and the spirit of the disinherited. So now Howard Thurman speaks to the disinherited. There's hatred there too, and it is born out of a great bitterness, a bitterness that is made possible by sustained resentment which is bottled up until it distills an essence of vitality. Thus, hatred can become a device by which a person seeks to protect himself against moral disintegration. And so he does to other human beings what he could not ordinarily do to them without losing his self-respect. This is an aspect of hatred that has almost universal application during a time of national crisis. Howard Thurman said this, and what I'm saying is that we are in a time of national crisis now. We are in a war of extreme rhetoric for now, division, and yes, hatred across our country and in our communities. Now, Thurman wrote to the disinherited, to those with their backs against the wall, to love people, told them to love people the way Jesus loved the tax collector, to love people, even enemies, while not condoning their way of life. It is not easy. It is a discipline and an overall technique to love one's enemy. Once the mutual discovery has been made that the privileged is a human and the underprivileged is a human, then these must be reconciled through the discipline of universal human experience. That we are each exceptional and we can each prove stereotypes. Both of those are true. We all have a lot of work to do here. The work of the privileged is to lift up the underprivileged. And for those without power, the work is to love each other and themselves and to define your own identity, your own faith outside of the privileged person's understanding, outside of that structure. I believe there is salvation in the religious community that can hold all of these identities together, particularly now when we are being divided in this constant war of words. This is the moment when our time for mutual respect and mutual understanding can save us, can save all of us. Unitarian Universalism should be the most rampant, largest religion across our country. It's time. If it has not come before, it sure has come now. This is what these mystic activists have all had to say to us over these past 6 weeks that we've been in this mystic activism series. We've heard from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, from Dolly Parton, from the poet Hafiz, from the writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, from Toni Morrison, and now from Howard Thurman. They are all telling us the same thing in their mysticism and their activism. They want us to see God in everyone and within, in ourselves, or to see the divine in everyone and in ourselves, to see ourselves with greater truth, all the ways we are privileged and all the ways we are not, to be honest and compassionate with ourselves when it is needed, and to be honest and harsh with ourselves when that is needed. We need not fear a Black Unitarian Universalism. It is already here, and it is beautiful. We can simply praise God or praise whatever it is you praise, that you are alive in this time to witness to this cultural expression of liberal faith, breathing life into the future of this faith community and inspiring a love that demands our action and our unending gratitude, our gratitude. So we can look to all the leaders of color, people of color in our congregation and support them, honor their spiritual expressions joyfully. And I'm talking to everyone. Everyone can do this for each other. Free of judgment, joyfully free of judgment, with an ethic of gratitude. This is how you will always, always keep fresh before you your moment of high resolve. May it be so. Amen.